I knew something was wrong before I even put my key into the lock. There was a new scratch on the brass plate beneath the deadbolt. Thin, precise, not the kind of damage caused by time or clumsiness. Metal doesn't scar itself like that. Someone had tested the lock carefully. I stood in the hallway longer than necessary, the grocery bag cutting into my fingers, and listened. Old buildings have their own language, pipes clicking, distant televisions, the slow breath of elevators. Nothing sounded out of place. Still, the air felt handled. When I opened the door, the entryway light was on. I never leave it on. That detail mattered more than it should have, because small deviations always matter more than dramatic ones. Big mistakes are obvious. Small ones are intentional. The lock turned too smoothly when I closed the door behind me, like it hadn't been fully engaged. Inside, the smell was wrong. Sweet perfume, cheap vanilla. It didn't belong here. My apartment smells like black coffee, lemon cleaner, and old paper. This scent sat on top of everything, like a fingerprint. In the living room, my armchair had been rotated slightly toward the window. Maybe 10 degrees. Just enough to change the line of sight to the street. Someone had wanted to see outside. On the side table, the coaster was upside down. I had placed it right side up that morning. I remembered wiping it after spilling coffee. Habit. I didn't rush. I moved through the apartment the way I used to move through audit rooms, slowly, letting the inconsistencies present themselves. At my desk, the top drawer was closed but not fully. It protruded just a few millimeters. Inside, the folder labeled pension had been disturbed. The papers were still there, but the order was wrong. A statement I keep buried in the middle was now on top. One corner bent where I never bend corners. This wasn't curiosity. This was someone checking a number. In the kitchen, my mail sat in a neat stack on the counter. Aligned, squared, helpful looking. I don't stack mail neatly. I open it, sort it, and file it. Anything left on the counter is deliberately messy so it doesn't disappear from my attention. The top envelope, my bank, had been opened carefully along the seam. The statement was inside, smooth, almost respectful. The balance line was circled. Not my handwriting. Circles claim ownership. I underline in pencil. That was when my phone vibrated. A message from Michelle. Hi. I stopped by earlier to check on you. You didn't answer your phone, so I let myself in. Everything looks fine. You really should keep the place brighter. Love you. The words were light, casual, familiar. They assumed permission. I didn't reply. I went down the hall to the bedroom. The door was open. I never leave it open. The closet door too. One shirt, an old blue Oxford, hung halfway off its hanger, as if someone had moved it aside and not bothered to correct it. I opened the nightstand drawer. The small envelope was gone. It didn't hold cash or jewelry. It held copies of my advance medical directive and the handwritten note with my attorney's name. Documents you only need if you plan to speak for someone. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for fear. It didn't come. What came instead was clarity. A younger man might have driven straight to his son's house, might have demanded explanations, raised his voice, created something that could later be described as agitation. That's what Michelle would have wanted. Because this wasn't about entry. It was about declaration. She hadn't rushed. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't made a mess. She had behaved like someone performing routine maintenance. That meant she believed my home, and my authority, had already shifted. I closed the closet door, straightened the shirt, turned off the entryway light, returned the bank statement to its envelope and slid it back into the folder exactly where it had been. Then I sat at my desk, opened a clean notebook, and wrote the date at the top. Not a diary, a log, time I returned, what was moved, what was missing, and the message admitting she had entered. The first entry took less than a minute. When I finished, I capped the pen and listened to the quiet again. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt staged. I am 71 years old. For 38 years, I worked as a forensic accountant. I followed money when people wanted it invisible. Corporate fraud, internal theft, manufactured incompetence. I learned early that the calmest person in the room is usually the one controlling the narrative. I retired on my own terms. My wife, Elaine, had been gone 6 years by then. Cancer doesn't care about preparation. After she died, I kept the apartment. The memories here are quiet. That matters. My life before Michelle's message was orderly. Morning coffee in the same chipped mug. News read twice. Once fast, once slow. Bills opened the day they arrived. Filed the day they were paid. Systems don't forget. People do. On Tuesdays, I walk to the market. On Sundays, I call my sister. On Sunday evenings, my son Daniel used to call. 10 minutes. Enough to maintain the line without crossing it. I never needed much from my son. Independence only works if you allow it. Then he married Michelle, and slowly, without confrontation, my life began to be treated like a problem to solve. That scratch on the lock wasn't the beginning. It was confirmation. Michelle didn't enter my life as a threat. She entered as a solution. That's how these things always begin. No pressure, no urgency, just help offered at the exact moment it's hardest to refuse. The first real shift happened after a minor health scare that shouldn't have been memorable at all. I felt lightheaded one afternoon at the market. Dehydration, the doctor said. Drink more water. Eat regularly. End of story. Daniel reacted as if I'd collapsed in the street. He insisted on staying over that night. Just one night, he said. Michelle came with him, carrying containers of soup and that same vanilla perfume that now lingered in my apartment. They moved through my space carefully. Too carefully. Asking where things were. Adjusting pillows. Turning lights on. So you don't strain your eyes. I answered because there was no reason not to. Yet, Michelle asked where I kept my medications. I showed her. She asked the name of my doctor. I told her. She asked how often I checked my blood pressure. I said. I don't need to. She nodded slowly, like I'd said something worrying. Before they left the next morning, she brought it up. Maybe we should have a spare key, she said lightly. Just in case. I hesitated. Keys matter. Access matters. I've spent my life watching what happens when people blur that line. But I thought of Elaine. Of the night years ago when she slipped in the bathroom and couldn't reach her phone. I thought of how thin the line is between independence and unnecessary risk. So I agreed. One key. Emergencies only. That was the moment everything changed. After that, Michelle's visits increased. Sometimes with Daniel, sometimes without him. At first she told me when she'd stopped by. Then she stopped mentioning it unless I asked. She began noticing things she couldn't have noticed unless she'd been inside while I was gone. You should replace the hallway bulb, she said once. It flickers. It didn't. Daniel offered to glance over my utility bills, just to see if rates had changed. I stayed in the room while he did it. Michelle watched quietly, saying nothing, absorbing everything. Then came the organization. Michelle showed up one afternoon with a plastic filing box and a label maker. She said my papers were a little spread out. She said it kindly, reasonably. Medical, financial, insurance, everything placed neatly into new folders with her handwriting. I told myself it was harmless, helpful, even. What I didn't realize then was that she wasn't organizing my life. She was learning its structure. Daniel began offering to handle small things. Online forms, appointment confirmations, password resets because the site was acting strange. Each task sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they created familiarity. They never demanded control. They accepted it gradually. By the time I noticed how often Michelle let herself in without asking, how often Daniel answered questions meant for me, how many decisions were being discussed without my involvement, the access had already become normal. They didn't break in. They were invited. And once invited, they never left. Pressure didn't arrive as an argument. It arrived as correction. Michelle began fixing things I hadn't asked her to fix. The thermostat, the placement of objects on my desk, the way my chair faced the window. Each change came with a soft explanation, delivered as if explanation itself erased the act. It's easier this way. You'll thank me later. I just want you safe. Safety became her favorite word. She used it constantly, and always in the same direction, toward less choice, less movement, less authority. Daniel followed her lead. He started calling more often, but the calls were shorter. Less conversation, more checking. Had I eaten? Had I slept? Had I gone out alone? Each question stacked on the last until they formed the outline of a problem I did not have. When I disagreed, even mildly, the tone shifted. You're being defensive. We're worried. You don't have to prove anything. Those phrases were never spoken angrily. They were spoken patiently, and patience, when repeated, becomes a claim of authority. Michelle began arriving without knocking. Sometimes I heard the door open while I was in another room. Sometimes I didn't. She moved through the apartment quietly, as if silence itself were permission. When I asked her not to do that, she looked genuinely hurt. I have a key, she said. I thought that meant I was allowed. Allowed. That word settled heavily, because allowance implies hierarchy, and I hadn't agreed to one. My boundaries started feeling negotiable in their hands, not because I gave them up, but because every attempt to reinforce them was treated as proof they were necessary. The pressure moved next to my routines. Michelle commented on what I ate, on how late I stayed up, on how often I went out. She suggested earlier bedtimes, fewer errands, shorter walks, always framed as care, always one step more restrictive than the last. Daniel began speaking for me in public. At the pharmacy, he answered questions before I could. At the bank, he explained my own accounts to the teller while I stood beside him. When I corrected him, he laughed and said, "He's particular." People smiled. Authority drained quietly. My mail started arriving opened. Not all of it, only the important pieces. Bank statements, insurance notices, anything with an official tone. Michelle said she was helping me stay organized. She bought another filing box and labeled it herself. My handwriting disappeared from my own records. Isolation followed naturally. Friends stopped calling as much. When I reached out, they said Michelle had mentioned I was tired. That visits overwhelmed me, that I needed rest. None of that came from me. Conversations shifted. Michelle spoke about me as if I weren't present. Daniel discussed my future in the third person. Assisted living came up casually, like a neutral option already agreed upon. Selling the apartment was described as eventually necessary. They used when, not if. I objected once, quietly. Michelle touched my arm and smiled. "You don't need to get defensive," she said. "That doesn't help your case." She said case without realizing it. Decisions began happening without me. Passwords reset, for security. Appointments scheduled without asking. Conversations held on my behalf. I was informed afterward, always reassured it was easier this way. I started locking my bedroom door at night. Michelle noticed immediately. "Are you scared?" she asked. "No," I said. She didn't believe me. Belief was no longer required. Humiliation came in small, precise doses. Jokes about my memory, comments about my stubbornness, stories told to others about things I'd supposedly forgotten. Daniel stayed silent. Silence did more damage than agreement ever could. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I adjusted. Slowly, deliberately, I felt myself being repositioned. From decision-maker to inconvenience, from owner to obstacle. They behaved as if my autonomy were temporary, something to be managed until it expired. They called it care. What it actually was erosion, methodical, polite, and designed to leave me with nothing solid to stand on. And they were confident. Confidence like that doesn't come from concern. It comes from rehearsal. I stopped correcting them on purpose. Not because I agreed, but because resistance was being used against me. Every objection was logged, interpreted, and quietly repurposed as evidence of instability. I had seen this pattern before. You don't win it by arguing. You win it by letting it reveal itself. So I changed tactics. When Michelle rearranged something, I said nothing. When Daniel answered questions meant for me, I let him finish. When plans were discussed as if already decided, I acknowledged them without committing to anything. Silence makes people careless. Objections make them cautious. I began observing the way I once observed accounts that didn't reconcile, not emotionally, but structurally. Who initiated a change? Who validated it? Who benefited from it? Who spoke last? The pattern was consistent. Michelle introduced concern. Daniel normalized it. Michelle escalated. Daniel framed it as consensus. They never contradicted each other in front of me. Agreement had already been established elsewhere. I began documenting. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Quietly. Dates. Times. Who entered. Who left. What was moved. What was said. I wrote in neutral language, the same way I'd written internal reports for decades. No adjectives. No accusations. Just sequence. I noticed Michelle preferred weekday afternoons, when she assumed I was out. Daniel came in the evenings, usually tired and less attentive. Michelle touched papers with bare hands and tried to put them back exactly as she found them. Daniel didn't bother. Familiarity made him sloppy. I left small markers, a receipt placed upside down, a folder aligned just slightly crooked, a note with a deliberate spelling error. Nothing that would alarm anyone. Nothing that could be called a trap. Just reference points. When those details changed, I knew someone had been there. When they didn't, I knew behavior had shifted. They grew more confident. Michelle began tidying rooms I hadn't invited her into. Daniel suggested shared cloud storage, so nothing gets lost. They spoke openly about my future as if it were already settled. Assisted living was mentioned casually. Selling the apartment described as practical. My routines referred to as unsustainable. They used when, not if. I asked questions that sounded naive and listened carefully to the answers. Michelle talked too much when she felt superior. Daniel lied when he felt cornered. I allowed both to happen. Inside, I wasn't afraid. Fear makes you rush. I wasn't angry either. Anger announces itself and invites response. What I felt was clarity. I had spent my career watching people collapse their own positions by underestimating records and overestimating goodwill. Michelle believed control came from proximity. Daniel believed it came from access. Neither understood leverage. I slept lightly but well. I kept my routines intact where possible. Structure is armor when pressure is applied deliberately. They believed I was fading. What they were actually seeing was me stepping back far enough to understand the full shape of what they were doing, and how they intended to justify it when it was finished. Once I understood that, endurance stopped being passive. It became preparation. The moment arrived without noise. No argument, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just paper. I came home earlier than usual one afternoon. The hallway was quiet, the way it always was at that hour. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and knew immediately that someone had been there again. Not because anything was missing. Because everything was arranged. My desk chair was pushed in. I never push it in. The lamp was angled away from the window, not toward it. Someone had been sitting there long enough to adjust the light. On the center of my desk lay a single document, squared carefully with the edge. Centered, presented. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't accidental. It was placed to be found. I didn't touch it right away. I stood there and read the title from a distance. Capacity Evaluation Request. My full name typed at the top. Correct spelling. Correct address. Date of birth. Identification number. Boxes were already checked. Difficulty managing financial affairs. Increased reliance on family members. Observed cognitive decline. Neutral language. Professional language. The kind designed to sound cautious while pointing in only one direction. At the bottom was a signature. Michelle's. Confident. Unhesitating. Beneath it was a second line. Blank, but dated. Today. I picked up the document and read it slowly, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to confirm something essential. This was not a discussion. This was not preparation. This was execution. Once filed, it wouldn't matter what I said. Any objection could be framed as confusion. Any resistance as denial. The process would explain itself. I folded the document carefully along its original creases and placed it back exactly where it had been. I returned the desk to its previous state. Chair angled out, lamp repositioned. No sign I had seen it. That evening, Daniel and Michelle came over together. They brought food. They talked too much. Michelle kept glancing toward the study. Daniel avoided looking at me directly. They were waiting for reaction, for panic, for outrage. I gave them none. I asked Daniel about work. I thanked Michelle for dinner. I listened while she talked about errands she'd run and people she'd spoken to, on my behalf. Everything was framed as done. Handled. I watched Daniel's hands. They trembled slightly when he lifted his glass. Michelle's didn't. She was calm, assured. She believed the system was already moving. Later, alone in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the reality settle completely. There is a line between tolerance and permission. That document crossed it. This was no longer about influence or pressure. It was about removal, about replacing my authority with theirs using process, not force. I felt no urge to shout, no need to confront them. Those reactions belong to people who still believe the other side might stop if asked. Internally, something closed. From that moment on, I stopped absorbing what they were doing. I began preparing to end it. Externally, nothing changed. I said good night. I wished them a safe drive. I locked my door behind them and opened my notebook. Under the date, I wrote one sentence. They have initiated removal. That was all. The decision wasn't emotional. It was procedural. And once a procedure begins, the outcome is no longer a matter of feelings. I did nothing visible for 11 days. That wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. When people believe they already have momentum, silence reassures them more than agreement ever could. Michelle believed the paperwork was almost finished. Daniel believed I was overwhelmed and retreating. Neither of them felt watched. That made them careless. I started with separation. I opened a new checking account at a bank Michelle had never mentioned and Daniel had never used. I funded it with a transfer small enough not to raise suspicion, scheduled during a period when Daniel believed my finances were tight. I opted out of digital alerts and requested paper statements only, sent to a rented mailbox 2 streets away. Old methods leave fewer fingerprints. Next came verification. I contacted a former colleague, not a family lawyer, not someone who knew Daniel, but a professional who had worked with me years earlier and understood documentation without needing explanation. I asked one question only. What establishes unimpaired capacity beyond dispute? He didn't ask why. He sent me a checklist within the hour. I scheduled my own cognitive evaluation. Privately. No referrals. No insurance. Cash payment. I requested a full battery, memory recall, executive reasoning, financial comprehension, decision-making capacity. I treated it the way I treated audits my entire career. Redundant, documented, defensible. The results were clear. Above average for my age. I requested certified copies. 3 of them, stored in 3 separate locations. At home, I began preparing duplicates. 1 category at a time. I removed original documents, medical directives, financial summaries, identification, and replaced them with indistinguishable copies. The originals were scanned, encrypted, and backed up offline. I logged access times on my router and matched them against Michelle's visits. The pattern confirmed what I already knew. I also stopped supplying information. When Michelle asked about my doctor, I said I couldn't remember his name. When Daniel asked about account balances, I said they fluctuated and I was having trouble keeping track. When they asked about mail, I said I hadn't seen anything important. I replaced resistance with uncertainty. They relaxed. Michelle began talking more freely about timelines. Daniel mentioned next steps. They discussed my future as if implementation were inevitable. Meanwhile, I assembled my record. Unauthorized entry, opened mail, third-party communications made in my name, conversations recorded legally in my own home, statements from neighbors who had seen Michelle enter while I was absent. Everything dated, everything cross-referenced. I didn't rush. Preparation isn't about speed, it's about alignment. Each piece has to support the same conclusion without explanation. By the end of the 11th day, nothing depended on my word alone anymore. They believed they were managing decline. What they were actually standing on was a structure that would collapse the moment it was examined. And they had no idea it was already being examined. The first mistake was impatience. Michelle had always believed momentum meant safety. Once enough steps were taken, she assumed the rest would simply follow. She mistook progress for immunity. It showed in the messages. She texted me mid-morning, casual and confident. "Don't worry about the utility bills. Daniel and I handled them already. You don't need the stress." There was no question mark. No request. Just an announcement. I didn't respond. 20 minutes later, a quiet alert appeared on my secondary email account. The one Daniel didn't know existed. My bank flagged an attempted change to my account permissions. Someone had tried to add an authorized user. The request failed. The confirmation code had been sent to a phone number neither of them controlled. That was mistake number 2. They assumed the surface was the whole structure. Michelle grew irritated when nothing happened. Irritation makes people careless. That evening, Daniel arrived without calling. He stood in the doorway instead of coming in, groceries in his hands like a peace offering. "Dad," he said carefully, "we need to talk about planning. Long-term things." Michelle stood behind him, arms folded, watching my face instead of listening to his words. Daniel set a folder on the table between us. Inside were printed emails, correspondence between Michelle and an assisted living facility. My name in the subject line. Phrases like care pathway and guardianship process highlighted in yellow. Attachments neatly clipped. Michelle had printed them on my printer. She hadn't meant to show me. Or she had, believing I was already boxed in. I turned the pages slowly. Michelle described me as increasingly confused, resistant to support, and financially vulnerable. She attached copies of my identification, my insurance card, and a scanned version of my signature lifted from an old medical release. Daniel watched me closely, waiting for anger. I gave him none. "We're just exploring options," Michelle said. "You don't have to get upset." Then she made the mistake that mattered. She pulled out another document. A capacity evaluation request. This one was complete. Her signature. And Daniel's. Blue ink. Clean strokes. Dated. Daniel's eyes dropped to the page for a fraction of a second. Long enough to confirm what I already suspected. "It's just paperwork," he said quickly. "Nothing's been filed yet." Michelle nodded. "We're being proactive." 2 days later, they made it worse. Mrs. Halvorsen from the 3rd floor stopped me near the mailboxes. "Your daughter called," she said gently. "She asked me to keep an eye on you. Said you've been getting disoriented." "I don't have a daughter." Michelle had begun recruiting the building. She hadn't asked. She hadn't coordinated. She'd simply started shaping a narrative, trusting repetition to make it real. That night, Daniel called from his car. The echo told me he wasn't home. "Dad," he said quietly, "can you just cooperate? You're making this harder than it needs to be." I asked one question. "Did you sign that form?" Silence. Then excuses. Michelle said it was standard. Michelle said it was protective. Michelle said it was necessary. He talked too much after that. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were committed. And in committing too early, too openly, they gave me what I needed without being asked. I didn't react. I documented. I waited 10 days before doing anything visible. That wasn't hesitation. It was calibration. People who believe they have momentum become careless if nothing interrupts them. Silence reassures them more than agreement ever could. During those 10 days, I restored control quietly. The first step was separation. I opened a new checking account at a bank Michelle had never mentioned and Daniel had never used. I funded it with a transfer small enough not to raise questions, scheduled during a week when Daniel believed my finances were tight. I opted out of digital alerts and requested paper statements only, delivered to a rented mailbox 2 streets away. Old systems leave fewer fingerprints. Next came verification. I contacted my former attorney, not the one Michelle had been researching, but the man who had closed my final internal audit before I retired. I didn't explain the family situation. I asked one precise question. What documentation establishes unimpaired capacity beyond dispute? He didn't ask why. He emailed a checklist within the hour. I scheduled my own cognitive evaluation. Privately. No referrals. No insurance. Cash payment. Full battery. Memory recall. Executive reasoning. Financial comprehension. I treated it the way I treated audits my entire career. Complete, redundant, defensible. The results were unambiguous. Above average for my age. I requested certified copies. 3 of them. Stored separately. Then I addressed the narrative. I booked an appointment with my primary physician, one I initiated myself. I explained, calmly, that family members had begun making claims about my capacity and contacting third parties on my behalf. I asked him to document my orientation, independence, and decision-making competence. I didn't ask for reassurance. I asked for records. Then I moved to containment. I replaced original documents, medical directives, financial summaries, identification, one category at a time. I left indistinguishable copies in their place. The originals were scanned, encrypted, and backed up offline. I monitored router access logs and matched timestamps to Michelle's visits. The pattern confirmed everything. Finally, I stopped feeding them information. When Michelle asked about my doctor, I said I'd forgotten his name. When Daniel asked about balances, I said numbers were hard to track lately. When they suggested help, I nodded vaguely. Uncertainty makes controlling people confident. They relaxed. Michelle spoke openly about timelines. Daniel mentioned next steps. They behaved like people who believed the outcome was inevitable. Meanwhile, I assembled the record. Unauthorized entry, altered mail, third-party communications made without consent, printed emails, witness statements from neighbors, audio recordings made lawfully in my own home. Everything dated, everything cross-referenced, nothing emotional. By the end of those 10 days, nothing depended on my word alone anymore. They believed they were managing decline. What they were actually standing on was a structure that would collapse the moment anyone looked at it closely. And someone was about to. They made the next move themselves. That was the mistake. Michelle believed momentum meant protection. That once enough steps were taken, the rest would follow automatically. She mistook activity for immunity. It showed in the messages. She texted one morning, light and confident, telling me not to worry about my utility bills because she and Daniel had handled them. A smiling emoji followed, as if cheerfulness could replace consent. I didn't respond. 20 minutes later, an alert arrived at my secondary account, one Daniel didn't know existed. Someone had attempted to add an authorized user. The request failed. The confirmation code had been sent to a phone number neither of them controlled. They had assumed the surface was the structure. That evening, Daniel came over alone. He brought groceries I hadn't asked for and set them on the counter like an offering. "Dad," he said carefully, "we need to talk about planning." Long-term. Michelle arrived 5 minutes later. She hadn't been invited. Daniel slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed emails between Michelle and an assisted living facility. My name appeared repeatedly. So did the phrase guardianship pathway. Michelle had printed them on my own printer. I flipped through the pages slowly. No shaking hands. No raised pulse. She had described me as increasingly confused, resistant to care, financially vulnerable. She'd attached copies of my identification, my insurance card, and a scanned version of my signature taken from an old medical release. She watched my face the entire time. I gave her nothing. Then she reached into the folder and pulled out the form. The capacity evaluation request. This one was complete. Her signature. Daniel's signature. Blue ink. Dated. Daniel's eyes dropped for half a second. That was enough. "It's just paperwork," he said quickly. "Nothing's been filed yet." Michelle nodded. "We're being proactive." Proactive is what people say when they've already decided. I closed the folder and placed it back on the table. "Thank you for bringing this," I said. They both froze. Not anger, not denial, just confusion. That night, I sent one email. Not to them, to my attorney. Attached were copies, screenshots, logs, witness statements, the printed emails, the signed form. No commentary, just records. 48 hours later, 2 letters were delivered. One to Michelle, one to Daniel. Identical language. They stated that neither party had permission to enter my home, access my records, represent my condition, or initiate any evaluation or placement. Any further attempt would be documented as coercive interference and escalated accordingly. Neutral, precise, unemotional. Michelle responded immediately. Long message. Apologies mixed with justification. Fear disguised as love. Concern framed as necessity. Daniel didn't respond at all. Instead, his workplace's legal department contacted him 2 days later. Someone had forwarded internal emails from a professional account. It triggered a routine inquiry. Nothing formal, nothing public. Enough. The assisted living facility sent me a written apology and confirmed my file had been flagged against third-party contact. My bank did the same. My doctor updated my records. The building manager asked Michelle not to enter the property again without my written consent. No one argued. Systems don't care about intent. They care about authorization. The pressure evaporated, not because they understood they were wrong, because they understood they were exposed. Silence followed, not the tense silence of conflict, but the quiet that comes after authority is clarified. I returned to my routines. Coffee, paper, order. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing needed to, because the moment someone tries to take your life apart quietly, the only response that lasts is one that leaves a paper trail louder than any argument. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was deliberate. For the first time in months, my days were shaped only by my own decisions. No unexpected messages, no visits framed as concern, no assumptions disguised as care. Silence returned to its proper function, not absence, but space. I didn't rush to fill it. I adjusted my routines with intention. Mornings stayed the same. Afternoons slowed down. I spent more time with paper than screens. Precision returns when interference ends. I noticed that immediately. Daniel tried once more. A voicemail, late in the evening. Careful, measured. "We've all had time to cool down," he said. "Michelle feels terrible about how things escalated. None of this was meant to hurt you. Maybe we should talk. Family shouldn't need lawyers." Family. That word appears when leverage is gone. I didn't return the call. Michelle tried next. A handwritten letter arrived 2 days later. Her handwriting was deliberate, rounded, designed to look sincere. She wrote that she missed me, that she worried she had overstepped, that everything she'd done came from fear of losing people she loved. She did not mention the forms. She did not mention the emails. She did not mention the signatures. Apologies that omit actions are not apologies. They are invitations. I placed the letter in my file and said nothing. Then the narrative attempts began. A cousin called to check on me. A former colleague asked if I was adjusting okay. The phrasing was familiar. Someone was still testing whether the old story could travel. I corrected each conversation the same way. "I'm well." There was an overreach. "It's been addressed." No emotion. No explanation. Just fact. After that, the calls stopped. I saw Daniel once by accident at a grocery store. We stood in the same aisle pretending to read labels. He nodded. I nodded back. Nothing more was said. That was enough. Michelle never contacted me again. Not because she understood my boundaries, but because she understood them. There is a difference. I reorganized my apartment, not because it had been disturbed, but because reclaiming space is a physical act. I replaced the lock. I returned documents to my own system. I removed every trace of someone else's order from my life. Each small decision reinforced the larger one. I accepted something then that I hadn't before. Boundaries are not punishments. They are filters. They do not exist to keep people out. They exist to determine who is allowed in. My life became smaller in number and larger in clarity. Fewer voices, cleaner lines, no ambiguity about who speaks for me. I still hear the word safe sometimes, used casually by others. I understand now what it often means. Controlled, predictable, convenient. I am none of those things. I am capable. I am attentive. I am responsible for myself. That is the order I return to. Not the one imposed on me. The one I chose. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.